Hi everyone, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. This time I want to talk about how to apply inductive Bible study principles to a larger block of scripture. Perhaps it's a really lengthy psalm or a larger segment within, say, a gospel. I want to use Psalm 88 as an example. Psalm 88 is a psalm of 18 verses, and a question I often get is when you're doing your interpretation, how do you work through it? Do you make observations on every single verse? And this would be a question that you would run into if you're doing a large segment in, say, a gospel, maybe Matthew 1:18 through the end of chapter 2. How do you deal with larger blocks of scripture? And this is where inductive Bible study principles are really important. And one of the key things is you start with your survey. And if we're looking at Psalm 88, you can divide the psalm into several main units. And then within those main units, remember, this is where structure comes in. Your major structures are the key to being able to deal with larger blocks of scripture. You take your major structure, and a major structure either connects main units or it controls 50% or more of the material. And so what you should do once you've done your survey is look for the most significant structure or a significant structure and begin with the strategic area for that structure. So with Psalm 88, we can look at the climactic section of Psalm 88, which would be the last main unit, verses 13 to 18. Now, if you're looking for the climax really specific, you could maybe say it's verse 18, but let's look at this last unit as the climax of Psalm 88. If you scan through Psalm 88, you can see that these verses capture some of the language from the initial verses in Psalm 88 and bring this lament to a really poignant climax by the psalmist essentially ending. He's still praying to God, so there's hope, but it's a very despair and despondent lament where it ends. You've taken from me, friend and neighbor, darkness is my closest friend, and then it ends. And so if this is the climax, what you want to do when you're interpreting Psalm 88 is you may not have time to do a thorough job looking at all 18 verses, but most of us can find time to work really carefully with this block, like a paragraph, or if you have to, go down to 1 or 2 verses. And what you do is you start with your structural questions. And so like for climax, your definitional questions for climax might be something like, what specifically and precisely is involved in the climactic section? And so that invites me then to do what? To begin my interpretation with the immediate context which would be what? My strategic area. That's what SA stands for, strategic area. So start with your immediate context, and this is where you're going to do your most thorough set of observations and inferences. And so you want to do your deepest digging, your most specific work. Most of your observations are going to be right here. And then once you've done a thorough job there, then you can step back and say, what's going on in the wider segment, or in this case, the wider psalm? And so we can then move to the psalm context. And what's key is when you have a structure, you want to ask yourself, like climax leads to this, because you could say, how does the rest of the segment lead up to this climax? And so then you can go back and you make some observations and inferences on a lower level. You're not going to go into depth into the other 12 verses, but you can go through there and gather further evidence that helps you to see how the psalm comes to a climax. So in other words, you can give substantive coverage to an entire segment, or in this case, substantive coverage of an entire psalm by really drilling down in the strategic area and then using the rest of the segment kind of as backup. And that's the key to using inductive Bible study, because it helps us with the principle of selection. Because we don't have unlimited time. Like if you're being paid to write a commentary or maybe curriculum on an entire book of the Bible and you have an exhaustive word count, then you could spend years digging through every single verse. But for most of us, we're maybe writing a sermon or a Bible study or preparing notes for a class. we have to be selective because we have limited time. And so the key to learning to apply inductive Bible study is to see how the different pieces, so in this case, we start with the survey. The survey helps us to see structure, which is what are the main units, and then what semantic or rhetorical relationships connect those main units. And then selecting the strategic area for that structural relationship that seems to be the most significant, and simply trying to answer those structural questions, beginning with the strategic area and then moving on a lower level to the rest of the context. And if you do that, you'll have a substantive interpretation without trying to say very little about every single verse. It lets you dig in deep in the strategic area. And again, the key to getting to a really rich, robust application has to be grounded in a substantive interpretation, and you get a substantive interpretation by digging deep in the strategic area first and then doing what you can from there. If you have any other questions, send them in to me, and I'll see you next time in our remaining videos. Keep up the good work. Again, I'm Brian Russell. Thank you for listening.